They sent me a bill for $15,000 for a fence I didn't ask them to touch on land that's been in my family longer than their entire fortune's been alive. And 6 days later, I was standing over a trench, watching their lights go out one circuit at a time, like a slow sunset they couldn't stop. Funny thing is, it wasn't even about the money, not at first. It was about the kind of quiet disrespect that creeps in when people think money rewrites history. My name's Daniel Mercer. I'm 62, retired electrical engineer, spent 35 years working grid systems up and down the Northwest, the kind of job where you learn real fast that everything runs on invisible lines. And if you understand those lines, you understand power, not just electricity, but people too. I live out in northeastern Nevada now, high desert country, about 140 acres give or take, a sheep ranch my grandfather pieced together after the war, cedar posts he cut himself, wire he stretched with his own hands, back when neighbors borrowed tools instead of filing lawsuits. You get used to a certain rhythm out here. Mornings smell like dust and hay. Afternoons hum with insects and distant wind. Nights go dead quiet except for coyotes calling each other across the valley. It's not fancy, but it's honest. My house is a timber frame from 1952, creaks in the winter, runs a little warm in the summer, but it's solid, like it remembers things. Then about 5 years ago, everything next door changed. That's when the Calderons showed up. Now I didn't know much about them at first, just heard through the county office that someone from California bought the old Miller land, the stretch right along my western fence line. Used to be scrub and a broken-down barn, nothing special. Within a year, that place turned into something out of a magazine. All glass walls, steel beams, imported stone, the kind of house that looks like it doesn't belong to the land it's sitting on. At night, it glows. Not warm light either. More like this cold blue white that spills out across the desert like it's trying to replace the stars. Victor Calderon, mid-50s, tech money, sold some company I don't pretend to understand. His wife, Elise, designs furniture or something like that. I saw her once in a magazine at the dentist's office, smiling next to a chair that probably costs more than my truck. They moved in quiet. No introduction, no handshake, just construction crews for months, and then silence. Never waved, never stopped by, just lived behind their glass like the rest of us were part of the scenery. I didn't think much of it. People come, people go. Land stays. Until that Tuesday morning. I was walking the fence line like I do every week. Habit more than necessity, checking posts, making sure nothing's leaning, making sure the sheep haven't found some creative new way to wander off. And right about halfway down the western edge, something felt off. You ever get that feeling where your brain notices something before you can name it? Like a rhythm's been broken. I stopped, looked out, and for a second, I honestly thought I'd taken a wrong turn. Because about 200 feet of my cedar fence was gone. Not damaged, not fallen, gone. In its place stood these tall glass panels, maybe 10 feet high, frameless, clean edges, reflecting the desert like some kind of mirror wall. Looked expensive, looked deliberate. I just stood there for a while, hands on my hips, trying to make sense of it. Wind brushing past, sheep grazing like nothing had changed, and then I noticed something tied to my gate. A white envelope. Thick paper. Fancy. Zip-tied, like it was meant to be found, not delivered. I cut it loose, opened it right there, and I remember letting out this short laugh, not because it was funny, but because sometimes something is so absurd your brain doesn't know what else to do. It was an invoice. Boundary enhancement installation, $15,000. Payment due in 30 days. No greeting. No explanation. Just a bill for replacing my grandfather's fence with their glass. I read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't missing something obvious, like maybe this was some kind of offer or mistake or, I don't know, a bad joke. But no, they had removed my fence, installed their own, and expected me to pay for it. I remember looking up at that glass, seeing my reflection staring back at me, dusty boots, old flannel, sunburned face, and behind that reflection, their house in the distance, shining like it owned the horizon. And that's when something in me shifted, not anger, not right away, more like a slow, steady tightening, the kind you feel before a storm rolls in. I walked back to the house, set the invoice on the kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and just sat there staring at it, listening to the clock tick, thinking about my grandfather out there driving those cedar posts into the ground by hand, thinking about all the years that fence had stood, through weather, through time, through everything. $15,000. For erasing that. I didn't call them. I called my attorney. Now, I don't like lawyers much, but I like being blindsided even less, so I rang up Carla Jennings. Been handling land disputes around here longer than I've been retired, sharp mind. Doesn't waste words. I told her what happened, every detail. And there was this pause on the line, just long enough to tell me she was thinking hard. Then she said something I didn't expect. Daniel, before we do anything else, I want you to check your utility easements. I frowned. What about them? Another pause. Just trust me. Go pull your property records. And Daniel, don't contact your neighbor yet. There was something in her tone, not concern, something else. Like she'd just spotted a thread I hadn't even noticed. So I hung up, grabbed my keys, and headed into town. And I had no idea. That little trip to the county office was about to turn their $15,000 bill into the most expensive mistake of their lives. So I drove into town that afternoon, same county building I've been walking into since I was a kid, tagging along with my dad. Nothing fancy, just a squat concrete place with flickering fluorescent lights and that smell of paper and dust that never quite goes away, the kind of place where history sits in folders instead of headlines. I signed in, nodded at Marlene behind the desk. She's been there forever, knows everybody's land better than they do, and told her I needed full records on my parcel deeds, plats, easements, everything going back as far as they had it. She gave me that look, half curiosity, half, this is going to be interesting, and disappeared into the back. While I waited, I kept thinking about what Carla said, utilities. It didn't make sense yet, but then again, a lot of things don't until they suddenly do. About 20 minutes later, Marlene comes back with a stack of documents thick enough to stop a door, drops them on the counter, slides me a pair of reading glasses I didn't ask for but probably needed, and says, "If this is about your new neighbors, you're not the first one asking questions." That caught my attention. I sat down at one of those old wooden tables, spread everything out, and started digging, deeds first, then surveys, then amendments, years flipping backward like pages in someone else's life. And then I started seeing it, little gaps, little inconsistencies, nothing obvious, nothing you'd notice unless you were looking for how things connect. See, most properties out here run on what we call easements, legal permission for utilities to cross land that isn't yours. Power lines, water pipes, fiber, all of it's mapped, documented, signed, recorded. It's boring, but it's everything. Except, in their case, it wasn't. I found the lines. Every single one of them. Three-phase electrical feed running from the main road, water line tied into the county system, fiber optic cable laid about 10 years ago, even a buried propane supply line. All of it cut straight across my land, about 3/4 of a mile total. But the paperwork didn't exist. No recorded easement. No signed agreement. Nothing filed with the county. Just blank space where something that important should have been. I leaned back in my chair, felt this slow, creeping realization settle in, the kind that starts in your gut and works its way up. "Hey, Marlene," I called out, trying to keep my voice even. "You got anything off record for the Calderon utilities?" She shook her head from across the room. "If it's not in that stack, it doesn't exist, Dan. Doesn't exist." I sat there a while longer, just staring at those maps, tracing the lines with my finger, imagining the current flowing through wires that, legally speaking, had no right to be there. And that's when I understood what Carla had seen. This wasn't about a fence anymore. This was leverage. I drove straight back home, dust kicking up behind the truck, mind running faster than it had in years, not angry anymore, focused. Calm in a way that probably would have worried people who know me well. I called Carla the second I got inside. "They don't have easements," I said. "I know," she replied, like she'd been waiting. "You checked already?" "I checked before I told you to look," she said. "I just needed you to see it for yourself." I let out a breath, half laugh, half disbelief. "So what does that mean?" "It means," she said slowly, "that every utility line servicing that property is technically trespassing on your land. And I can shut them down." Another pause. Longer this time. "Legally, yes, but not without giving notice. And Daniel, if you go that route, there's no halfway. This becomes a full-scale dispute." I looked out the window toward that glass house catching the late afternoon sun, shimmering like it owned the desert. "They already made it one," I said. She didn't argue with that. All right, she continued, voice shifting into that precise, methodical tone lawyers use when things get serious. First step, get a licensed surveyor out there. Confirm the boundary. If their glass panels crossed onto your property, even by an inch, that strengthens your position. Second, formal notice. Certified letter. 72 hours to respond and negotiate proper easements, or you proceed with disconnection. And if they ignore it, they won't, she said. People like that never ignore risk, they just underestimate it. I smiled a little at that, because that sounded about right. So the next morning, I got to work. Day 1 surveyor. His name was Pete Lawson, been mapping land out here longer than I've been fixing circuits. Quiet guy, sun-creased face, carries his equipment like it's part of him. We walked the fence line together. Well, what used to be the fence line, and he set up his gear, took measurements, cross-checked with county plats. Didn't take long. He straightened up, adjusted his hat, and said, "You're not gonna like this." I raised an eyebrow. "Try me." He pointed at the base of one of those glass panels. "They're over your line, about 4 inches. 4 inches. Not a lot, unless you understand what it means." "Enough?" I asked. Pete gave me a look. "More than enough." I nodded, felt that same steady calm settle deeper. Day 2 letters. Carla drafted them. Clean, direct, no emotion. One addressed to Victor Calderon personally, one to his attorney, if he had one, which she assumed he did. It laid everything out, the encroachment, the lack of easements, the 72-hour window to negotiate, or I would begin disconnection of all unauthorized utilities crossing my property. We sent them certified, signature required. And then we waited. Now waiting is a funny thing. It either eats at you or it sharpens you. For me, it was the second. I kept busy, checked on the flock, fixed a loose hinge on the barn, changed the oil in the truck, but in the back of my mind, there was this ticking clock, not loud, just steady. About 36 hours in, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. "This is Daniel." Pause. Then a voice, smooth, controlled, the kind of voice used to being listened to. "Mr. Mercer, this is Victor Calderon." Of course it was. "I received your letter," he continued. "I assume this is some kind of misunderstanding." I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out at the land between us. "What part seems unclear to you?" I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. "The part where you're threatening to disrupt essential services to my home," he said. "That's not how reasonable people handle boundary issues." I let out a small breath through my nose. Reasonable people don't tear out someone else's fence and send them the bill. Silence. Then a slight shift in his tone. Less polished. More real. "The fence was obstructing a sight line," he said. "We improved it. The invoice reflects shared benefit." I actually laughed at that, couldn't help it. "Shared benefit," I repeated. "That's one way to put it." "Look," he said, voice tightening just a bit. "If this is about compensation, we can discuss numbers. But your letter, it's not about numbers," I cut in. "It's about ownership." Another pause, longer now. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "We'll handle this through legal channels." And there it was. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "That's fine," I said. "Just understand something. Victor, your house doesn't have legal access to a single utility crossing my land." Silence. Then, very quietly, "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm stating a fact. 72 hours. And I hung up. I stood there for a second, phone still in my hand, heart beating a little faster now, not from fear, from momentum. Because I knew exactly what came next. Day 3 was over. Day 4, we started digging. Day 4 started early. Earlier than usual, even for me. I was up before sunrise, coffee in hand, standing on the porch watching that pale blue light roll over the desert, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. You ever get that feeling right before something big happens, not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable? That's what it felt like. By 7, the excavation crew rolled in, 2 trucks, a backhoe, and a couple of guys who didn't ask questions, which is exactly what I wanted. I'd worked with them before on drainage trenches, good people, steady hands. I walked them out along the marked line where the main electrical feed crossed my property, showed them the survey stakes, the flagged path, and just said, "We're exposing everything today. No cutting yet, just uncover." One of them, a younger guy named Luis, glanced toward the Calderon place in the distance, all glass and morning glare, and then back at me. This gonna be a problem? I took a slow sip of coffee. It already is. Machines fired up, engines rumbling low at first, then biting into the earth. That first scoop of dirt always sounds louder than it should, like the ground itself noticing what you're doing. And I stood there watching that trench open inch by inch, knowing exactly what was buried underneath, knowing exactly what it meant. We hadn't even gotten 20 minutes in before my phone rang. This time, it wasn't unknown. It was a law firm. I answered. Mr. Mercer, this is David Klein, representing Mr. Calderon. I'd advise you to cease all excavation immediately. You're interfering with critical infrastructure. I looked down into the trench, where the top of the conduit was just starting to show through the dirt. On my land, I said. That infrastructure services a private residence, he replied, voice clipped, professional, a little too fast, like he'd been handed a situation that escalated quicker than expected. You could be liable for damages. I let that sit for a second, then said, calm as I could, you might want to check the county records before you start throwing that word around. Pause. Then, more cautious now. We're reviewing documentation as we speak. Good, I said. Because unless you can produce a recorded easement, that infrastructure doesn't have legal standing. Silence on the other end. Then, we're filing for an emergency injunction. I nodded to myself. You do that. And I hung up. Now here's the thing about people who are used to control. When they lose it, even a little, they don't always know how to respond. They go back to what's worked before. Lawyers, pressure, urgency. But those only work when the ground under you is solid. By midday, the trench was fully open along that first stretch. Conduit exposed, clean, undeniable. You could trace it with your eyes straight toward their house, like a vein. And right around 1 o'clock, Carla called. They filed, she said. Yeah, I replied. Figured they would. Judge reviewed it already, she continued. Denied. I leaned back against the truck, closed my eyes for a second, not out of relief, but confirmation. On what grounds? I asked. Property rights, she said. Lack of documented easement. They have no immediate claim. I let out a slow breath, looked out across the land again. And for the first time since this started, I felt something close to balance. All right, I said. Then we keep going. Day 5 was quieter. No calls in the morning, no sudden moves, just tension hanging in the air like heat. The crew continued along the lines, exposing more of the network, electrical, water, even the fiber line. Thinner, but just as important. Around noon, a black SUV rolled up my driveway. Didn't take a guess to know who it was. Victor Calderon stepped out, dressed casual, but you could tell it wasn't really casual. Fleece vest, clean jeans, the kind of outfit that looks effortless until you realize it's probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But what stood out wasn't the clothes, it was his face. He looked tired. Not physically, mentally. Like someone who just realized the rules they were playing by didn't apply anymore. He walked up slow, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the land like he was seeing it for the first time, or maybe realizing it had never been his to overlook. You've made your point, he said. No greeting, no introduction, just that. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, nodded once. Have I? He glanced toward the trench in the distance, then back at me. This doesn't need to go further. I studied him for a second, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just trying to understand the man standing in front of me. You replaced my fence, I said. Sent me a bill for it. His jaw tightened slightly. That was the miscalculation. I almost smiled at that. Yeah, I said. It was. We stood there a moment, wind moving through the dry grass, distant hum of machinery still working the far line. Then I stepped inside, grabbed the folder Carla and I had put together the night before, and handed it to him. He opened it right there, flipping through pages, and I watched his eyes move, fast at first, then slower, then stop. $875,000, he said, looking up. $850 for a 50-year utility easement, I corrected. $25 for annual maintenance, prorated. $45 for the fence. $18 for legal. Comes out to $913. He stared at me, not angry, just processing. That's extortion, he said finally. I shook my head. No, that's retroactive permission. Silence. Then I added, or you can reroute everything. New permits, new lines, new approvals. County told me it'll take about 2 years, maybe more. Cost you somewhere around $3 million. And you'll be sitting out there the whole time without power. I let that hang, watched it land. And that's assuming, I continued. You can even get the neighboring parcels to agree. I already spoke to 3 of them. They said no. That part wasn't entirely necessary, but it was true. Victor looked back down at the folder, flipped a page, then another, then closed it slowly. What else? He asked. Rebuild my fence, I said. Cedar. Old growth. Same way it was. He nodded once. And a written apology, I added. Not for me, for the record. That one he hesitated on, just a fraction. Then, fine. We stood there a second longer, something unspoken passing between us, not respect exactly, but recognition. You understand, he said. This isn't how things usually work. I gave a small shrug. Maybe not where you come from. He let out a breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Monday, he said. You'll have your answer. And he walked back to his car. Day 6 came and went without a word. Day 7, same. I didn't push, didn't call, didn't check. Some decisions take time, especially when they cost more than pride. Then on day 10, I was sitting at the kitchen table, same spot where this whole thing started, coffee in hand, when my phone buzzed. Carla. It's done, she said. How done? I asked. Wire cleared this morning, she replied. 913,000. Agreement signed. Recorded. You now hold full easement rights with inspection authority within 200 feet of your property line. I sat there, quiet, letting that settle. And the fence? I asked. They've already contracted a crew, she said. Work starts this week. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. All right, I said. Thank you. I hung up, looked around the kitchen, same old table, same worn floor, same ticking clock. Nothing had changed. And everything had. Over the next couple weeks, I watched that glass come down, panel by panel, loaded onto trucks, hauled away like it had never belonged there. In its place, new cedar posts went up, thick, solid, the smell of fresh cut wood carrying on the wind, not the same as my grandfather's, but close enough to feel right. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered this time. Short. Formal. Signed. An apology. I read it once, folded it, set it aside. Then I took that original invoice, the $15,000 one, and put it in a frame. Hung it right above the coffee pot. Not as a trophy, not exactly. More like a reminder. Because here's the thing, this was never just about money. It was about lines, the ones on the ground, the ones in the law, and the invisible ones people cross when they think no one's going to push back. Some people build walls out of glass, thinking it makes them untouchable. Turns out, glass cuts both ways. Now, I'm not saying I handled it perfectly. Maybe there were easier ways, softer ways. Maybe I could have knocked on their door that first day, tried to talk it out before things escalated. But then again, they didn't knock on mine. So I'll leave it to you. If someone tears down something your family built, replaces it without asking, and hands you the bill, do you let it go? Or do you remind them exactly where the line is? Because out here, lines still mean something. And I'm curious, what would you have done?